Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished senior branding guru from Singapore, Mr. Andrew Crombie. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Ashutosh. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Andrew is the Chief Branding Officer of Crombie Consulting. He's a startup brand specialist, a management consultant. Andrew has earlier worked with Ogilvy, Fitch, and other agencies, and he has worked with several global brands. So, Andrew, before we start talking branding, tell me a little bit about your own journey.
Okay, so I think the key word in what you just said was senior, which is a bit of a worry, but because it can be quite long. But so short is that I was born in the UK, grew up in Australia, and I've been in Asia for 32 years now, I believe. Wow. Probably most of those in Singapore, and a lot of it on Singapore Airlines, unfortunately. Yeah. I started at American Express back in the early 80s. So on the client side, went through into the agency side, direct marketing, then into brand advertising, then into what they called at the time integrated marketing. It was very popular at the time. Orchestration was the Ogilvy term at the time. Went into health marketing and advertising. I had a health marketing agency. And then more recently, as it became more acceptable, I got into retail and experience design, which is really where people walk into brands. And that's the common thread, all the way through there. In the first half of my career, brands weren't the thing. I think you probably remember, Ashutosh, that, we did advertising or we did marketing, and that was the thing. But brands sort of happened in around about the mid-90s, really started to take hold when the value was realized and quantified. And that's where, naturally it sort of led me to where I am now, which is focusing on brand strategy.
Fantastic. And how would you define branding, and why is it important for businesses? And when I'm talking businesses, I'm talking for small and medium businesses.
Okay, so definitions is always the interesting thing. There's so many definitions about brands and it's a brand, what's branding. The two are different. So first off, I need to make that clear. Whether it's Jeff Bezos who says that a brand is, what they say about you when you leave the room, or Marty Neumeier, who is a popular commentator who says that it's a gut feeling that you have about a company or a product or a service. My view of brands is a little bit more sort of neuroscience related. So brands are the current sum of impressions, associations, or experiences about a company, a product, or a service. So if we were then translated into branding, and so they're effectively memories, okay? It's the same way memories work in your brain. Brands are working the brain the same way. So branding is really the art of shaping those future memories, company, a product, or a service. And why is that important? It's important because brands, as I said, brands only exist in your brain, in your mind, and preference, which is very important to business, and successful business only exists in your mind. So you've got to win that battle in your mind if you're going to win in business.
Correct. Well said. And, if it's often been said, Andrew, that brands are living beings. And I've said that brands are like children. They have to be nurtured from the time they are born. The question is, how can brands stay relevant for a long period of time?
Okay, so the key thing really is to, when you go back to brands, so brands need to, first of all, know what they stand for. So this is right in the heart of brand strategy. So you start a brand strategy, you need to know why you're in business, who you exist to service or to help, what you stand for, how you're going to present yourself. So more about the brand identity and so on. And the biggest mistake that brands make is that, and a lot of people think about brands, is they see it as a decoration, something that you just do and set and forget, and that's it. So your idea that they're like children, I think, is very true, because brands are changing, they're interacting differently in the world, the market's changing, the world that they're growing into is changing, and so you constantly need to update them. And so the key thing about this is you need to understand, you keep consistent the why of the brand and update the how and the what, if I could say it like that.
Well said.
So I suppose an analogy there is like if you're sailing a course in a boat. I do a lot of sailing, so it's an easy analogy. It's about adjusting the sails and adjusting the attitude of the boat to the prevailing waves and wind.
Correct.
And that's what you're doing.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And my next question is that how can small businesses create a successful brand identity?
Okay, back to what I said before. So you have brand strategy and you have brand identity. So again, for a small business, the most important thing to do or to start with is to set the brand strategy. So to understand the marketplace that you're going to be going into, so forward-looking rather than backward-looking, to understand where the consumer is and what they're after and what their needs or their riches are that you're going to scratch. And then once you've got that mapped out, the idea is to then work out what would be the personality or the style or the way you should present yourself in order to be differentiated from the competition and meaningfully sort of relevant and attractive to the consumer. And so that's where brand identity comes in. And so how do they create a successful one? Is by knowing who they want to be, that's the best form of themselves in a way that's going to be received or attractive to the audience, and then defining, whether it's your logo, your color, mnemonics, and so on.
And you're a startup brand specialist as well. What are some of the common mistakes a lot of businesses or startup businesses make when it comes to branding?
Okay, probably a lot of them, but I think the most ones are, first of all, I think branding is a decoration, especially startups. So startups have they're usually started by people with a technological bent who've created something that's very unique, a product or an IP capability or something that they're taking to market. And so consequently, they're not naturally market-oriented or consumer-centric. You've probably heard the term human-centric, consumer-centric. And that's a big problem. So they see branding as being a decoration, something that you do after you've done everything else, just before you're going to market. And that's a big problem. So the first mistake is that. Secondly is not integrating the brand into the business or the business into the brand. The two are inseparable. As I said, they all exist, how they're perceived, how they're preferred, all exists in the mind of the consumer. And so you really need to make sure that at every touch point, the brand is delivered. The business is a bunch of touch points with the consumer marketplace, and the brand needs to be purely and consistently represented in each one of those. So that's the second one. I think this idea, as I mentioned before, the set and forget mentality is that you're nurturing children analogy. I think exactly that. So you wouldn't leave your children to just go off and be who they are. You want to be with them all the way. Unfortunately, they don't think the same way, but anyway. And the last one is being too inward focused. I think, again, startups, classic, they're so focused on what they're doing and what they're making. It's going to the best. We're all going to be rich. We're going to be Bezos or, whatever, great success story. And they forget that they've got to relate to a market, and that there's probably, if you're having the idea, the guarantee that there's 20 other people out there in the world having the same idea. So you've got to keep your, as we say in sailing, head out of the boat. You've got to be at the course, not at your feet.
Well said. My next question now moves to, did the digital impact on branding? I remember 4 decades ago when I started, there were basically cinema halls and big billboards, etc.
Yeah.
Full page newspaper advertisements.
And we love that.
Today, everything has now changed and come to your little handheld device.
Yeah.
I wanted to get your perspective on how is the digital age changing the way businesses are approaching branding?
Okay. So first, I think we've got to look at what it's done to us. So, there's two sides to this. There's digital as a medium, which you've seen through your phone and so on, or through your screens and so on. And then there's digitization, which is a complete reformatting of what the experience is, how you live. It's every aspect of your interactions with the world. and that's not just through screens, that's through, all lots of other things. So I think that, what's it done? It's first of all, it's reinforced this thing that we sort of suspected for a while, and some prescient writers were talking about, which is that the consumer owns brands, not the companies. And I think it's made it very clear. They can click you off at a second.
Correct.
It's crazy, So you are now on the back foot as a brand owner, and what you have to do to engage, entertain, seduce that viewer for the little time that they're going to give you. Secondly, it's lowered the barriers of entry. So it's created, and with that has come massive amounts of noise. I mean, any person, and post-COVID, now that everyone's working from home and lots of small businesses have started up, everyone's out there on the internet trying to build their profile, do things, with, all saying the same thing as everyone else. I mean, the competition is insane. So you've got that. It's always on 24/7. We've got the advent of data. So how's it really changed the way that businesses are approaching branding? Well, first of all, I think it shifted us from, as I said, from digital as a medium, Web 1.0 type stuff, where it was about the content, you just read the newspaper or looked at a blog or something, to more Web 3.0, where it's a place you walk into. So we've got this experience mentality, which is great because brands have moved from being an inward, here's what we decorate, here's what we advertise, here's what we're telling, here's what we're going to do to you. And now we're in this space where here's what we've created, here's what we're going to do with you. And it's full customer journey. It's not just at the point of sale or a little bit, at the earlier stages of the funnel. It's now end to end, from the dreaming phase when people don't even really know that you're in existence, but they think they might have a problem, all the way to achieving what they want to get out of it, whether it's from product performance or from a community or what have you. So it's really helped us in that way. It's expanded. It's also complicated it.
Right.
Into that later, I suppose. But I think the other thing, and it's made it very fragmented. That's the other thing. This micro targeting has meant that branding means you've got to connect so many more dots to create. You talked about outdoor and TV and that. In the old days, well, I said I love it, because it was so simple, and you'd
Correct.
TV up and you'd go, wow, that was fantastic. It was great to build. It was it's a great idea, but it was very simple. But now you've got to connect so many dots across so many interactions of micro targeting. And so building the halo effect of a brand that you really need, that sort of sense around idea of a brand, is much harder to do in the modern world. So you need different type of people, different type of thinking, but the rigor of good brand discipline, I think, is now more important than ever.
And of course, then there's the entire aspect of social media, which is moving at the speed of nanoseconds. So how are brands managing to stay relevant in media, which is moving at such high speeds?
Well, I mean, the media market's always going to change. I mean, we've seen that over the last since day dot, basically. So I'm not sure that the media, it's brought more speed to it, and that's changed the nature of attention and so on. I do quite a lot of work in precognitive attention, and it's, there is no doubt that, you need to be more distinctive. You need to get your message across faster. You need to draw people in and tell a story, build a consistent narrative and so on, because you've only got a couple of seconds. You can't build a brand in a couple of seconds. Correct. But when you add a couple of seconds with a couple of seconds with a couple of seconds with a couple of seconds, all of a sudden you're starting to build out meaningful narrative space that you can start to tell your story a bit better. So the best brands understand that. The best brands don't look at it as a transaction that's a once only, or and just purely on clicks or what have you. They see it as being an investment that they're building over time, telling a story, building a franchise, building a tribe, a movement, if you like, on social media. And that's only done over time and with consistency.
Interesting. My next question is about trends that you're beginning to see, and you must be working with many different brands across multiple organizations. What are some of the current trends that you are seeing in branding that businesses should really be aware of?
Okay. Okay. So I think first and foremost, I think I'm working a lot in alternative proteins. So really the most obvious trends are the ones that are closest to me. This idea of authenticity and transparency and these trends are coming from the consumer. So obviously Gen Z starting to prevail. They're moving to the workforce. They're starting to get money. Their influence is going to increase. So they've sort of replaced the millennials to some extent and all of that. Now they're demanding more proof than we, people of our age. We were a bit naive, I suppose. They're big companies, they're big brands, sure, they're trustworthy, but Gen Z aren't so sure. They want you to prove it. So supply chain, how the work is being treated, are you sourcing this from stuff that's not killing the Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. So, understanding the authenticity of a product. I mean, it's expressed in the food marketing. So what they call clean label, you may have heard, which is, instead of you've got a list, exactly what's in it. They try to have the simplest sort of makeup of. They're demanding that. So clearly, sustainability, authenticity and transparency is the first.
Right.
Next one would be sustainability, which is closely tied to that. Eco-consciousness. So again, going back and proving what's your footprint, how are you not doing damage, how are you actually making the world better, what's your policy. And this is important not just from an external brand point of view, it's from an internal brand point of view. If you want to hire young people now, they're giving you the once over before they come to work for you on the basis of, are you someone that will help them project their consciousness and conscience about the world in the way that they want to be associated. So there's that. And again, aligned to that is purpose-driven branding. A little bit old now, it sort of happened about 5, maybe 7 years ago. Everyone sort of got on the purpose bandwagon, and a lot of brands were trying to retrofit purposes, and purpose is what would you be doing, or what are you doing for people if money wasn't the main motivator? So, what good are you doing for the world? And, some brands did that really well, like Patagonia has a natural purpose. They've had it from day one. You may have heard of a brand of sneakers called Kuruma, I think it is. They're all planting trees, and they get you engaged. Every time you buy sneakers, they plant trees. It's fantastic. So they're very purpose-driven, and they've got proof all the way through. But you've got the ones who've just bolted on a purpose but don't have it running through the whole organization. But I think, and not every brand needs purpose, because when it's that deep, if it's a very low involvement product like most of the consumer CPG products, FMCG products, people aren't going to stop and think too much about it unless you're really doing some damage. So you've got to choose your battles when you're doing purpose branding. They'd be probably the biggest trends that I see. They're all related, and they all have a downside. Obviously, purpose washing, greenwashing, falsification of sustainability credentials, etc.
Well said. Great response. Thank you. And a related question would be that how is technology changing brands and brand managers?
Okay, so how's it changing? So I think we talked a bit about the technology and how it's clearly there's a different need for brand managers. Before there was more art, I suppose, is one way of saying it. Now there's more science. I mean, they need to be more technically aware. They need to understand the complexities of being online. The ultra micro targeting is it's stopped brands having this shared currency. So they've got to do the work at understanding how they're going to piece together their brand story across so many faces. So it's made it harder. On the other hand, everything is quantifiable. So you can immediate response, you can track everything, you can do A/B split. The dream of direct marketing in the day was doing A/B split testing, and at Amex we were the best at it. We split run every single test. That was our gold standard. Run a test against it, which was best. It became the new gold standard. You can do that in real time across a lot of fronts, fantastically in digital, that you can't do in brand advertising. It's just too slow. the impacts and measurement is too slow.
Correct.
So, that's probably the biggest change, is that and I suppose the other thing is that they're sort of becoming a bit more tactically focused because of the urgency and the demands being placed on them by their managers, and all the way through to the stock markets who are demanding immediate responses. There's a bit of less long-sightedness, I think, in terms of the way they're looking at.
Fantastic.
Brands.
So, Andrew, I've got time for 3 more questions. Since we just spoke about technology, let me ask you about the metaverse. And the metaverse, which seems to have, got a little bit of cold water poured on it after Facebook decided to go slow on the meta. But the metaverse is changing the way the consumers and the brands are interacting with one another. And large brands like Nike have also started to acquire a lot of real estate in the metaverse. I'd love to get your thoughts on how is the metaverse changing the way the consumers and brands will work with one another.
Okay, so I mean, I'd have to put a caveat on this, is that I'm no expert in the metaverse. I think it's evolving so fast, it would take me all day to keep track of it. I think I probably speak for many people on that. But how's it changing? So first of all, I think it's a new marketplace. It's a totally new world, virtual world. So what is it? It reinforces everything I said about virtual worlds and brands operating in your minds and that. And if you understand that, so from a branding point of view, nothing changes, because you're still dealing with people. You're dealing with how they form ideas, how they form memories, how they build preference, and so on, where it all happens. So the same processes are still there, and a lot of the same disciplines apply, consistency and so on. However, the opportunity is massive, because you're freed from the constraints of having to deliver a physical product or a physical service or something like that. You can test ideas, you can bring the future forward faster. You can create worlds where much more integration or collaborations. So how's that going to change for consumers? I think there's 3 ways for consumers. I think there's a lot of potential for brands to go and express themselves and do things. And we'll find out more about that as we learn. But 3 things. So first of all, I think that it's a world for escape for consumers. So they have the potential to be something in the real world and to live a totally different life in the metaverse. So how are they going to do that? Is it an alter ego persona thing? It's like sort of going to a beach town on the other side of the country and being somebody else for a couple of weeks a year. You can do that in the metaverse. Second thing is experience. I think, as I said, you can create experiences that just can't be created in real life, too expensive, too complex, and so on. I think that thing is really attractive for consumers, and they're expecting brands to really look at going 11/10ths, get up to 11, as they say, on experience. And then lastly, I think that's community. I think, we've, through the threads of the internet and social media, one of the great things about digital is it's brought out what we always knew, was that brands are about affinity groups. They're not about demographics or even about psychographics. They're too blunt as instruments. But affinity groups are where people who are vastly different come together around a subject and may have nothing in common in any other part of their life. The beauty of the metaverse is that, you can be whatever you want to be in that community. You can play your roles within that community, but the power to build communities and take ones that are only threads on the internet, but make them real and perceptually substantial in the metaverse, I think is very interesting.
Amazing. And my last question to you, Andrew, and this is, when I was reading about you, you did a lot of great work with 2 very successful brands, Tindle and Moi. I hope I have the pronunciation correct. Tell me a little bit about the work you did with them and what were some of your learnings?
Okay, very, very quickly, because I could go on. So Tindle, just for those who don't know, Tindle is as we say, ridiculously good chicken made from plants. Okay. So it's an alternative protein, and with them, the 4 sort of founding gang of, or the band of 4, so sort of the original Beatles, came to me with an idea, or a couple of ideas of where they might position, but weren't really sure what they might do with this great sort of product format they had. They engaged me. I then did a very deep study into the competitive world, the environment, the changing environment around alternative proteins. This was only 2 years ago. and also the consumer and where they were coming from, who was the core, the key agitators in the space, what was driving them. So put that all together, developed a brand positioning, understood the semiotics and codes that they had to abide by for once they could break, and then created a brand strategy and a proposition for them. And then we took that into brand identity and then naming and then go-to-market strategies and so on. So it's been very successful. They're bit of the pet brand of the alt protein community, is certainly in this part of the world, because they're the fastest growing chicken brand. They're red hot in the space. They set world records at fundraising at their seed levels, getting $30 million, and then again at Series A, getting 100 million. So they're records for the whole category. So Possible didn't do this, Beyond didn't do this. These guys are really, really hot stuff. And so they're virtually, I suppose, based on valuation, a unicorn. So that all came in 2 years, out of my strategy and then out of the brand we created for them. So that's pretty good. Quickly, Moi is a alternative protein as well, but it's in the dairy space. So it's a alternative dairy brand made from plants. Same process again, which is my signature process. I dive very deeply into competitive, deeply into consumer, and then look for ways that we can bring our specialness to create a unique space and to own a new space. And we did that the same thing, but they're a bit further behind in the development. We've only just started to launch them about 4 weeks ago, in fact, and they were bought just before they were launched. So that's pretty unusual story as well. So two great brands. Amazing to see where they're going to go. I just can't wait.
Absolutely fantastic. And on that note, Andrew, thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey. Thank you for speaking to me about so many different aspects of brands and branding. Thank you for speaking to me about the metaverse, and thank you for sharing with me the stories of two amazing brands, Tindle and Moi, that you were involved with. Great. Thank you again, and good luck.
Thanks, Ashutosh. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.